So this section is the beginning of talking about sexual reproduction. And so we want to talk a little bit about what is sexual reproduction, why do we need sexual reproduction versus asexual reproduction. And we are going to focus on how does sexual reproduction actually happen. It's very different from asexual, where you just copy what's already there. So a definition of sexual reproduction includes that there are two sources of genetic material. Of course, when we talk about genetic material, we're really talking about two sources of DNA. And a lot of times we'll call these two parents. And so the offspring are considered a genetic combination of the two parents, but they're not an exact half and half combination. So they are going to be genetically variable or different. The other reason we talk about them being variable is each offspring is a different combination of what the parents are. When we look at the advantages, why would we use this versus asexual? Because one of the disadvantages is you do need a partner. You can't do this type of reproduction on your own. And it also requires making special types of cells, which we'll talk about in a moment. But the real advantage is this genetic variation really creates what we call biodiversity, which is going to help the species survive better. This biodiversity or variation is going to be really important for natural selection. So when the environment is changing, if the environment changes, then our species might not be at an advantage. And so the advantage of sexual reproduction is that we have this built-in variation that kind of gives a buffer or protection to the species in case the environment were to change. When we look at the disadvantage, this means it's going to take more time. So sexual reproduction is definitely slower. Sometimes we get undesired combinations. So sometimes the combinations don't end up being a successful combination, and that can kind of decrease the health of the species. But because we're having variability and each offspring is unique, usually this is kind of mitigated or assuaged by the fact that we have so many offspring. So when we look here at a single species, we can see lots of variation in different traits. Here are your Jonas brothers, and the main idea is that we'll have some similarities, especially if they have the same two parents, but we are going to have variety. The other disadvantage is this need for unique cells. And so in order to combine cells, in order to combine two sources of DNA, we're actually going to have to reduce the number of chromosomes. If we're combining DNA, we don't want to, so for example, in humans, 46 plus 46 would equal 92. This is not desirable. So I don't want to just add a skin cell and a skin cell and get a baby. That won't work. Now I have way too much DNA. So when we look at the life cycle, we see what's called an alternation of generations. And what this is really referring to is the ploid word. What we'll see is that sexually reproducing organisms are going to make what we call gametes. And gametes are sex cells, and they come from what are called germline cells. Germline cells will divide twice to create 4 haploid cells, we'll talk about this in a second, that are genetically different. So what this means is that a skin cell cannot divide to produce sperm or egg. It has to be a very specific type of cell, these germ-line cells. And the way that they're going to divide is called meiosis. It will have a lot in common with mitosis, but it is not exactly the same. So we have to be aware that we've got these two different types of cell division, and depending on the need of the organism, a cell will either undergo mitosis or meiosis. Let's talk a little bit more about what actually the point of this is. The idea of haploid is that in an organism, when they have homologous pairs, I'm going to separate those homologous pairs so that each parent donates half of the total number that the offspring will have. So if the offspring will have 46 in a body cell, then I want each parent to donate half of that, which would be 23 in the sperm and 23 in the egg. So applying this to humans, I've got a human whose body cells all have 46 chromosomes. A germline cell will undergo meiosis, reduce that number. This is one of the biggest ideas of meiosis. I'm reducing that number, but very carefully, because I want to make sure that they get back to the correct amount of DNA. So I'm going to go from 46, I undergo meiosis, I get a sperm, an egg. They're each called haploid because they are half of the original. The original is called a diploid cell because it has two of each type of chromosome. And so the diploid cell undergoes meiosis, becomes haploid. The two haploids combine during fertilization. I have this newly fertilized egg called a zygote. The egg will then undergo mitosis to become a whole organism. I copy this cell many times to become a multicellular organism. A little extra thing here is this concept of N and 2N, because each species has a different chromosome number. So instead of having to talk about humans being 46 and fruit flies being this and on, we can actually just use N to represent the number of different chromosomes and 2N to represent the diploid number. So we definitely want to take some time to kind of become familiar with all of these words. And this phrase, alternation of generations, refers to the fact that at some point in the life cycle, some cells will be haploid and some cells will be diploid. And we look at how often does that happen in the organism's life cycle. So the big idea about sexual reproduction is that when you make sperm and egg, sexual reproduction hasn't happened. They still have to come together in fertilization. So lots to kind of wrap our head around and a lot of new vocabulary words. And so I'd like for you to kind of pause and take a second and try and go back in and fill these in. What does it mean to be these words? What do these words mean? But then also looking at why is it important to have these words? Why do I need to talk about a gamete versus a somatic cell? Try to kind of start to connect those words. So if you need to pause it here, that's fine. We can go over these words more back in class a little later. We do want to talk real quickly about what types of organisms use sexual reproduction. We want to be able to look at, of course, we would think about, well, what is the advantage? How easy is it to find a partner? Some organisms are actually going to go back and forth. Some organisms can reproduce asexually. One example is parthenogenesis. And this is seen actually in some reptiles. And they're able to take an unfertilized egg, which is N, haploid, and double it, and then start making an organism. Now the offspring will actually still be different from the parent, even though all I'm doing is copying what the parent had. Because the mom could have given this part of her chromosomes pair, or this part. And then the combination in the eggs will be different. So the offspring still have variation. She just didn't need a partner to do that. So we are going to see that all eukaryotic cells will do this at some point. But the majority of organisms that do this are going to be animals and plants. We will see it in some protists, we will see it in some fungi. So the lab that we will do as part of this unit will actually look at how fungi are able to make haploid cells and then a diploid organism, or sometimes just create lots of spores. So take a second and look at this alternation of generation diagram and see if you can talk your way through it. What is a zygote? What would mean a colony? What's actually happening there? Why would this be important? What does it mean to make a spore? What must they be referring to here? What ploid must a spore be? So taking a second to look at the idea that it's not just animals that do sexual reproduction, but lots of different organisms. So pause the video if you need to. I do want to go ahead and introduce how meiosis is similar to mitosis and different from mitosis. And this way you can kind of start to wrap your brain around why it's good that they're similar and then why it can be confusing. Both of them are examples of cell division. They're both types of cell division. They're both part of the cell cycle. So it's not that every single cell in the woman's ovary is undergoing meiosis all at once. We're going to see lots of cells that are just waiting in the cell cycle and interphase. Because we're a type of cell division, to prep for cell division, we are going to undergo DNA replication. We are going to use checkpoints to regulate this process. We are going to use the spindle to divide the nucleus. Keeping in mind this only happens in eukaryotic organisms. But there are going to be some big differences between mitosis and meiosis. And what we want to keep in mind is the purpose. If we look at mitosis, the purpose is identical cells. If we look at meiosis, the purpose is to create haploid cells and to have variety. So the differences will all come from the purpose. The differences are going to lie in the fact that meiosis divides twice. And the reason that it divides twice is really to create those haploid cells. Now we could create haploid by just taking a cell and dividing it once, but that would only make 2 cells at a time. And we actually want lots of haploid cells, especially if you look at other organisms and how they reproduce. For example, amphibians. They're going to leave their eggs out in the water. They use external fertilization because you're not always going to run into a mate at that moment. So some organisms, the reason they need lots of egg and lots of sperm is that the females will actually deposit the eggs and leave and hope that a male actually happens upon them and leaves their sperm. And so we're going to see that one of the reasons is we need lots of them. So we're actually going to divide twice. And we'll stop there.
Ms. Helms and Mr. Heiliger, homeroom students need to see their teacher, homeroom teacher.